think we are good to start. Now it's there. Okay. So welcome everybody here to our Mars webinar. Sorry for that 5 minutes delay. Today we have a wonderful topic, 10 years AMNOG. What have we learned for drug development and pricing with our speakers, Stefan and Professor Dr. Thomas Hammerschmidt. Stefan, next slide, please.
Sure.
Exactly. So once welcome here from the Mars, the market pricing strategy. We are the German-speaking market access experts for Austria, Germany, and Switzerland for the so-called DACH countries, not DAX countries, DACH countries, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And we are your experts for price and reimbursement strategies for drugs or medical devices. We also do have various expertise in health economics. We support you with all your reimbursement decisions with the stakeholders, as the GBA, the Federal Joint Committee, the BfArM with the DiGAS, the digital health applications, the Swiss BAG, and the Austrian Hauptverband. And of course, we help you with a negotiation, with a price negotiation support, including our virtual reality boot camps, where hopefully when Corona is over, you know, we are not stuck to Zoom meetings anymore, but in face-to-face meetings. But we learned something from Corona, that virtual reality can support also us training. You know, in the training. So here now we are with the webinar. Questions welcome. So I want to encourage you to feel free to ask your questions you have after presentation. We will have time for your questions, and you can already raise your questions during the presentation. There's either the question answer function here in Zoom, or you just write it in the chat here in Zoom next to it, so we get that, and then we come later. And one of the always important questions is, well, can we get the slides, or do you have a recording? Yes, all these webinars will be recorded. Go to our webpage on www.marketaccess-pricingstrategy.de, and there you find all the recordings. And also, we have a YouTube channel. So check it out, our YouTube channel there. There's also like the last one, the Swiss, the Alps, with our good friend Remo from Switzerland. Yeah, and now our presenters today, you know all, Stefan Walzer, who's the CEO of Mars. And today we really welcome our good friend, Professor Dr. Thomas Hammerschmidt from the University of Applied Sciences, Rosenheim. Welcome, Professor Hammerschmidt.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. Wonderful. And now we come to our topics. Last Friday, there was a big celebration party, only like sparkling water and, you know, cheese
plain
crumbs,
water.
Plain water, yeah. Tap water, you know, we have to save money. So broke system. 10 years AMNOG, what have we learned for drug and development and pricing? Stefan and Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lutz, for the introduction. Thank you, Thomas, as well, to join us. I think we're looking already forward to your kind of thoughts, because I think you have as well already seen, let's say, the various kind of aspects also in your different roles, I think, in the industry, but also now, obviously, from the academic perspective. So, I mean, Lutz, you have as well just said it. I think last week there was the kind of celebration. It was obviously as well digital. And I think according to Professor Heckner, it was efficacious. It was economically given and driven as well. So I think he was also looking forward already to say 20 years AMNOG. How could we maybe celebrate that? But I think before we come to that, I think it's probably more as well the question, what have we learned so far? And I think today and this evening, probably also for the kind of two dimensions. One is for drug development, which is obviously the first part, the first step as well in the development of a new kind of product. And also then finally the pricing, which is obviously as well linked to each other. So I think before going into the kind of processes and the different kind of learnings, I think where do we stand? I mean, how much of kind of assessments and how much was really done, let's say, in the last 10 years. I think what you see here is just the numbers until 2019, but overall until March 2021, we have had already more than 500 assessment which went through the GBA, which were as well basically then assessed within the so-called AMNOG process. So what is the AMNOG? I think for most of you, I think you might know that already. So very briefly, just really, I think at the end of the day, I think it's important that there needs to be a dossier, a so-called dossier then being submitted to the GBA at the day when the product is being available in Germany. And availability is basically defined as the price availability in the official price database, which is the Lauer-Taxe in Germany. And hence that's the day when the dossier needs to be submitted and with the GBA in their system. I think important here maybe as well to mention, which is not on the slide, there's also a completeness check possible before a submission, which means that the dossier could be sent to the GBA and they just check it if everything is included. It's not from a content perspective, but really more, let's say, from the different kind of, let's say, template parts and chapters which need to be filled out. Then the process is basically for 3 months, which is the benefit assessment, which is normally done by IQWiG. For orphan drugs, it's basically done by the GBA, only partly done by IQWiG, which is then just focusing on costs and the epidemiology, so the patient numbers. And after those kind of 3 months, it's going as well into the kind of decision making, let's say, with the GBA, which starts as well with a preliminary assessment publication of the GBA benefit assessment, which is then also what you, for example, as well can see on the website of the GBA. The decision making includes then as well an oral hearing, which we'll cover as well in a couple of minutes, as well a written statement, which is as well important, where all of the affected stakeholders could basically submit their kind of opinion on the preliminary findings, on the preliminary assessment, which is then all being taken into account with the GBA. Finally, they come up with a conclusion if there's an additional benefit. If not, obviously, that has then the implications on the pricing. I think that's afterwards as well a bit of the question, especially in with respect to the additional benefit. How much was maybe or could maybe have the additional benefit have an impact on the pricing? I think at the end of the day, I think that's maybe also nothing really new, but just to bring everybody, let's say, on the same page. I think that overall kind of benefit assessment takes 6 months. So 3 months for the benefit assessment, 3 months for the decision making within the GBA. And then there's another 6 months, which is then for the price negotiation with the Statutory Health Insurance Fund, with the head association of them in Berlin normally. If that is not, let's say, sufficient, meaning there's no agreement on the price, there's then also the option to call up the arbitration board, which we'll just cover very briefly as well this evening, but not really in detail. This might as well then take for another 3 months. I think important is as well, obviously, there's free pricing for the first 12 months. If it takes longer, there needs to be then as well the kind of payback if a new price is then being agreed on. So the aim is quite clearly, I think, establishing the evidence in order to have an added benefit. I think nothing new as well here. I think there are the different kind of added benefit levels. I think from, let's say, the lowest one, which means that there's a lesser benefit, a geringerer, so meaning that the product is even less efficacious than your comparator, which I think has been, let's say, decided on, I think, in 2 subgroups in all of those 500 assessments we have seen so far. Then you have the different kind of levels of no added benefit, and then the positive ones, which start with non-quantifiable, up to the highest one, which is significant or a major added benefit. In German, it's erheblich, which has been granted just 5 times overall. I think important also here to mention, I think for orphan drugs, there are only 4 potential additional benefit levels, meaning that the whole kind of system has changed after the first times. That also for orphan drugs, the added benefit is basically granted by the marketing authorization, meaning the only kind of question is really on the level of the added benefit, so the extent of the added benefit, which is also something keeping in mind when maybe having a look on the different added benefit assessments by the GBA. So overall, I think, what is the kind of distribution? I think I have already mentioned, I think 2 of those, let's say, assessments had the results of lesser added benefit. I think with one, I personally think it was probably more a political kind of decision, which was, I think, kind of combination therapy with products which have been already on the market. I think then you have still a good number, I think, of significant added benefit with a 92, 3 with a major. That was by the end of 2019. I think in the meantime, with 5, I have just checked that this evening, just haven't had the time, sorry for that, to update the graph. Then we have had 83 minor added benefits, which doesn't mean that there is just a minor kind of benefit at the end of the day, just the rating of it, right? I mean, there is a benefit, so it's nothing to let's say, yeah, to probably not target for. And then finally, you have as well 91, which got a non-quantifiable added benefit, which I think also the majority, if you have a look on the details, is also being driven by orphan drug assessments, where especially obviously keep in mind that for some of the orphan drugs, it was maybe not even possible to run RCT, or maybe debatable. With some, I think you could maybe discuss if that was maybe possible, but it was at least not provided and available at the time of the submission. Hence, there was just, let's say, the non-quantifiable added benefit, which is the kind of, let's say, added benefit level by the GBA if there's no added benefit otherwise possible to be granted. I think there are also some granularities in the meantime, whether it's a non-quantifiable added benefit based on the information, so meaning the data of it, or whether it's a no added benefit, a non-quantifiable added benefit based on the legal requirements. Finally, there is also 200 of assessments which basically ended up with a no added benefit, meaning this is not an exclusion, which I think is as well an important point as well, especially when comparing that to other countries. This just simply means that you go basically into the price negotiation and you cannot negotiate a higher price than your appropriate comparator therapy. So you see still, let's say, roughly 60% of the assessments received an added benefit. I think in the meantime, I think most of the companies and most of the kind of, let's say, people around, stakeholders around the kind of system can, I think, more or less already assess the kind of submissions quite appropriately, even beforehand, to also see where this might realistically as well end up. I think what I just as well wanted to mention very briefly, because we're also coming up with the kind of potential differentiations between IQWiG, let's say, recommendations and GBA decisions, finally, is the so-called GBA oral hearing. I think the oral hearing is, to me, I think one of the core and important kind of steps within the whole kind of AMNOG process. So the first one is quite clearly having the dossier, having and sending that to the GBA. Then there's that kind of internal assessment and discussions. But within the oral hearing, there's as well the opportunity to discuss open questions. Important here maybe as well, discussions is maybe a bit too wide, I think, to my, let's say, from my perspective. First of all, the questions and open points are not raised and handed over to the company which has submitted beforehand, but are just raised within the meeting. And secondly, it's also not really a discussion, it's more kind of question, and the industry needs to be giving the answer. But I think the important step here in there is especially also that clinicians might be heard and also ask for their opinion within the oral hearing. I think this is as well one of the core and important steps within the whole kind of AMNOG process. This was also shown, for example, by Professor Wörmann as well at the 10 years AMNOG kind of event, I think just end of last week. I think he has quite nicely shown here as well the number of assessments with medical associations and the number of involved medical associations. I think it's highly recommended, I think also from my side, I think in order to include and involve as well clinicians and even better the respective medical associations in the oral hearing. What I've also mentioned just very briefly, I mean, just keep in mind the kind of process within the AMNOG, let's say, assessment, or within the assessment of the dossier. I think you have the first part for within the kind of first 3 months, where normally as well, let's take the orphan drugs here maybe aside, where the IQWiG is especially then assessing and recommending their kind of benefit assessment. And after another 3 months, you have then as well the GBA, who is then deciding on the added benefit finally. And obviously it's very interesting as well to see where there are maybe kind of, let's say, common results. So meaning IQWiG would basically have the same kind of assessment than the GBA, or the other way around. and where there might be maybe potential differences. I think what you can see here in the orange kind of boxes is where IQWiG is basically having the same kind of idea as the GBA. And I think in general, I think there were around 1/3, so around 30% of all assessments which have not been, let's say, a kind of commonality in terms of results for the added benefit between the IQWiG and the GBA. So I think let's stop with the kind of, let's say, putting everything on the table, meaning how does the process look like? I think most of you have seen that and maybe have even experienced that as well in the last couple of years, or at least heard about it. I think now coming to the kind of topic, what have we learned for drug development? And then afterwards as well from the pricing perspective. So I think, first of all, I think it was a quite nice and interesting analysis. I think when I had first seen that, I think there might have been as well various impact factors for the likelihood of an added benefit, dependent a bit also, for example, on the different kind of areas. I think interestingly, I think we have had also that discussion in the past whether oncology is maybe kind of separate, let's call it entity, even a separate disease area where maybe even the kind of focus might be. I think just generally, I think if you compare that, and I think that analysis just simply shows if, let's say, the kind of, let's say, curve or the line is basically on the right-hand side of the one, that means that a drug has a higher chance of an added benefit, which basically shows that with oncology, you would have a significantly higher chance to have an added benefit. Just take that as given. I think whether just in oncology, you might have, let's say, better trials, or maybe trials with the kind of more acceptable endpoints, maybe a question mark. I think you could also probably find other kind of, let's say, studies, or let's say strange kind of studies in the oncology area. I think that's maybe as well something keeping in mind. And I think I would not probably focus too much on that. I think interestingly, I think for me is probably more the kind of target population. I mean, if the target population is, let's say, below 250,000, it looks at least that the chance, that the likelihood for an added benefit is maybe a bit higher. I think you could maybe as well turn that again a bit around, because I think that number is as well quite similar. We'll see as well in a couple of seconds in terms of a pricing impact. But I think overall it could also be seen as maybe the kind of budget impact is not that huge, and hence there might be maybe a bit more of relaxed kind of way to decide. You could imagine, or you could interpret it that way. I would probably not do that. I think it might just seem, I mean, you see as well the kind of wide, let's say, confidence intervals around it. I'm not sure really why that might be potentially a driver. I think the rest of it, I think, is quite evenly distributed, and I think no significant kind of differences. I think ultimately, and that's also, I think, what I have just very briefly as well said, I think what is, let's say, the kind of clinical trial basis, right? I think what are the needs of the payers? I think generally, I think we'll cover that as well just in a couple of minutes with you, Thomas. I think is mortality, morbidity, quality of life, adverse events. I think maybe also a question to you afterwards. I think I just put that in red here, no progression-free survival. I think there are some debates around it. And I think the last couple of, let's say, month or maybe even few years, I think there might be maybe even a kind of movement potentially, but I think that's maybe also open for a discussion later on. I think what I just want to say here is, I think if you plan for clinical trials, I think do it appropriately, obviously, and then as well include the kind of endpoints which are important as well from the GBA's perspective, if you want, obviously, to include and need to include the views of the GBA as well. So ultimately, is overall survival the core endpoint? I think I would probably generally say yes, of course, but I think it's the overall as well study design which is important. So it's not only the endpoint, I think it's the whole kind of concept. And I think a probably quite difficult experience as well, which has been shown in, I think, the first and initial assessment with eribulin in breast cancer has exactly shown that. I think you see based on the left-hand side, the graphs and also the overall survival numbers there. So there's a significant difference between eribulin, which is Halaven, versus the comparator in the comparator arm. So it's a hazard ratio of 0.805 and significant, as said. And I think at least in those early days, I was also just thinking, yeah, I think this will be a kind of positive added benefit for the overall group. And it was not, because ultimately There were a lot of, let's say, subgrouping and also kind of different, let's say, therapy lines, which were included in that kind of trial. And hence the GBA has based on those kind of different, let's say, let's call it more subgroupings as well, that only for some patients, they have a certain, a minor added benefit, even just a minor. And then for all of the others, there was a no added benefit granted. This was the initial assessment. There were further assessments afterwards, but I just want to say here as well, do not only focus on the endpoints, but really having a look on the overall kind of study design, which is, I think, as well important. So just what are those, let's say, general study design standards, right? I think just a few of those. I think there are obviously a couple of more. It's always good to maybe discuss those with the GBA, but it's quite clear with the study duration. I think at least 6 months are acceptable. Again, depending a bit on the study design. On this on the disease area, on the indication. I think better would be a year. Also, depending a bit on the treatment duration. If is it just given once in the kind of patient path, or is it given continuously? That's obviously as well a question. But also, for example, more methodological kind of questions are behind. For example, like the randomization methods. Not all of those are basically accepted. I think most of those which are more or less normally used in clinical studies are accepted, but they need as well to be described, for example, quite in detail. I think if you want to run it to the highest evidence level, quite clearly also if you have 2 confirmatory RCTs, the likelihood is higher. It's not always a must, but it's at least higher. And obviously, again here, saying it's not just that RCTs need to go and show the same results, but also the RCTs with the same kind of, with similar kind of designs and with the right kind of endpoints, comparators, etc. I think a couple of further things more, again, from the methodological perspective. I think if you have multiple testings, you need as well to control for that when you go with your significant analysis for the significance testing as well. So that's as well something where the GBA is really a bit picky sometimes, and quite clearly as well, for example, on the right stratification factors, especially if you go into the kind of subgroupings, etc. And finally, I think that's really nothing new, but quite clearly one of the core drivers, the kind of correct country-specific comparator. So it needs to be the appropriate comparator, which the GBA wants to have. And I think important here, maybe we just put that as an example, best supportive care is not always best supportive care, because also best supportive care is basically defined. And that's also well something with the GBA is a lot of times checking in the submissions. I think also here, I think when planning for the drug development, when planning for different clinical trials, it's also quite directly important that the specifications of the adverse events are as well done in the right way. Obviously, I think the meta terms, I think I've never seen an issue with that, but sometimes they're just different kind of levels and different kind of, let's say, items which have been analyzed, which are maybe not that important for the GBA, but maybe others which are important have not been prospectively been planned for. So that's just well something keeping in mind. I think there were and are as well a couple of minimum statistical requirements. A p-value needs always to be calculated. I know, and we know as well that let's say from a methodological perspective, sometimes it's not the right thing to do. There might be different rules and regulations in the study protocol and the statistical analysis plan, but it needs to be calculated, and also with a different kind of, let's say, statistical measures here, for example, relative risk, odds ratios, etc., but also something very specific for the GBA is the so-called HSG, which is an effect size measure. So what does that really show? I think it just simply shows that planning is obviously the most important part within the whole kind of clinical development. I think an early GBA engagement or an early consultation, I think from my perspective, in order to be as successful, or let's say to be really successful with your submission, is probably of utmost importance. Keeping in mind quite clearly, I mean, we've seen that also with some of the large industry companies here. I mean, when you have obviously already submit, let's see, 3, 4, 5 breast cancer dossiers, I mean, you know the market, you know the appropriate comparator and the endpoints, etc. That's also quite clear. But I think it's at least something keeping in mind if you're entering a new indication, a new disease area, or even entering, let's say, Germany as a new market. I think this is, from my perspective, a really important possibility in order to check also your clinical trial design. I think when to start with, probably around clinical phase 2, in order to also inform at least then your phase 3 package, which is, I think, important for your planning as well. So what to do? I mean, if maybe not everything is perfect, I think just a few things. I mean, if you obviously don't have an RCT, I think you could try it with maybe a historical comparison or some further kind of parts. I think likelihood to be successful is then really low. Obviously, when do you really have an RCT? I think most of the times just when you're off drug. I think interestingly, there has just been a recommendation by AQUIC, I think early this year, on a minor added benefit, even just with a single arm study. This was, I think, at least to me, a big surprise, but it at least shows as well that the whole kind of package needs to be good and important. I think otherwise, clearly, if you have the wrong comparator, difficult again, but you could maybe try it with indirect comparison network meta-analysis. I think most of those are as well not, let's also put it on the table, probably not accepted by the GBA, but I think most of the times also here, it was already the kind of issue that, let's say, the kind of whole planning of the network meta-analysis, especially from a systematic literature search perspective. And also that was one, let's say, critique point. The other critique point was also then when thinking about let's say the definition of the different kind of subgroups and the kind of further impact and the comparability of the different clinical trials included there. Wrong endpoints, you could obviously always come up with a kind of argumentation for a, let's say, correlation of that potentially surrogate endpoint to a more hardware endpoint. If that is acceptable, I think it could be debatable. And then finally, there's also maybe if the quality of the trial, the data itself are maybe not that good. I think that's maybe as well where potentially, at least from, let's say, an importance perspective of the product and also of the disease areas where, for example, the oral hearing might help in there. So this is just in a kind of nutshell, and I'm looking also forward. I think Thomas, I think what you might and want to tell us well around that. I think moving, let's say, to the second part of the AMNOG, right? First part is the clinical assessment, meaning that clinical and drug development is the core driver, and then now finally the second part is then which kind of impacts have we seen so far on drugs pricing as well. So this is basically I think what happens after the benefit assessment, right? You go into the fight with the head association of the statutory health insurance fund. So how does it look like? I think before, let's say we put it pre and post COVID-19, there was and is basically meetings happening in Berlin in the rooms of the head association. So you have a negotiation room, I mean, as well on the picture, and then also a preparation room, which normally looks exactly the same. So you can as well go back and forth, I think, with different kind of breaks, etc. But this is basically how it looked and how it might look again in the future. I think since the COVID-19 pandemic, Lutz has already mentioned that. I think this is as well happening through web conferences, which also means that there might be further kind of challenges around it, especially within the negotiation team. Sometimes it's better then as well just to come together and still have a kind of, let's say, a negotiation team meeting that you have and could just speak, let's say, in one room to each other while negotiating, but also others, let's say, other kind of opportunities can help here, like messages or also even separate kind of telephone lines. It's just a bit more, let's say, complex, let's call it. But I think in the meantime, this works as well quite well. How does the negotiation look like? I think you have the 6 months. This is what I think was quite clear. I think you have basically 4 meetings, which are then directly scheduled after the GBA benefit assessment. And then there could be basically 5 participants per party, which could then go in there. Each meeting lasts for 4 hours. Thus, let's say, sounds quite long, but I think ultimately, I think especially towards the end of those negotiations, I think the kind of time is as well a bit, let's say, condensed, and you feel as well the kind of pressure, even that I think, let's call it in the first meeting, I think it's probably too much time, but that also depends a bit, obviously, on the product. Furthermore, I mean, drivers we'll just see as well in a couple of seconds, but we have as well the European reference prices in a way. I think obviously, because we know that, I think a lot of times those countries are not available directly, at least not in the initial assessment with the GBA, and hence with the price negotiation of that product. But in case there might be reassessments or new assessments around the product, then those prices might as well be available. Or, for example, as well, if the GBA benefit assessment was also just limited on a timely matter. So which are the drivers? I think there's a bunch of different things. And again, this heavily depends obviously on the product itself. So this is more the kind of question, what might be the drivers on the price discount? Because you see in there as well at the arbitration board, obviously, this might obviously have as well an impact on the price discount itself. I think this also heavily here, especially the arbitration board, for example, heavily depends on the product itself. I think it could go really both ways. I think it could be in your favor. It could also be, let's say, in your disfavor when thinking about the discount. But I think overall, I think it's also important. European prices, we have just heard, the extent and the probability of the added benefit is as well, at least somehow a kind of a driver, but also, for example, things like time limitations, because this might as well give you another, let's say, drive within the negotiations, but also conditional approval. And for example, what we put in there, mixed prices, which means if you have a product with different subgroups and different kind of added benefit levels within those subgroups, that this might as well obviously have an impact there. Important finally as well, I mean, just leave that as well, obviously, to the end, which is the type of the so-called ACT, the appropriate comparative therapy. I mean, if you have obviously a high priced comparative therapy, it's a bit, let's say, easier in a way to negotiate probably. If it's more on the lower side, it might be a bit more difficult. But again, it's just all of those things could have an impact, and it finally, anyway, depends on the product itself. I think what has been as well, let's say, thought of in the early days as well is the correlation between the size of the target population and the negotiated annual therapy cost. I think you see basically as well, let's say the higher, let's say the kind of target population, I think the lower in a way the annual therapy cost. I think that's at least, I think what you can see out of those kind of data points. I think that was already as well, let's say, felt in the early days. I think it's logical in a way, and I think it's you can feel it as well when you go in those negotiations because of the very simple kind of budget impact. Even though, keep in mind, we don't use basically budget impact models like, for example, in the UK or other countries, but indirectly you have that as well. Then I think when you have had a look, and we just put in here two examples, I think one is the AMNOG report 2020, and one is the source by Tidal et al., which was published in 2016. And I think overall, I think they more or less show very similar kind of results, even though that in the left-hand side, the Tidal paper shows as well the differentiations between orphan drugs and the overall kind of drugs, including different kind of size of the target population. But I think ultimately, and that's also what you see on the right-hand side, I think the average kind of price discount is generally around 20%. Quite clearly also when you go, let's say, down from that average dark line, basically, then you have the average price discount for the added, if you have positive added benefits, so meaning that you could also have a lower added benefit. When you see also over time, I think the whole kind of, let's say, uncertainty as well going down. So I think this also shows a bit that maybe all sides are as well learning. I think just personally as well, that I think especially, let's say, the companies are as well just firstly going in a bit more informed from the price expectation, meaning where to set the price as well, and also from the benefit expectation maybe. And what you see as well above that is maybe the kind of price discount might be a bit higher if there's maybe no added benefit as well included there. But obviously, and again, this is just the average. I think you nicely see that in the left-hand table as well. The minimum and the maximum kind of discounts could vary heavily. And I mean, if you're not the average, but maybe on one or the other side, you could be happy or maybe quite unhappy as well. So meaning as well, you need to still prepare yourself very well for the price negotiations. I think arbitration boards, I think just very briefly, I think, which is maybe interesting if you, let's say, follow the kind of middle line, which is that quite, let's say, dark orange line, which shows the number of let's say, decisions by the arbitration board. The first one is just when arbitration, let's say, cases are, let's say, started, which could also be just a kind of, let's say, negotiation tactic further. That is why that number is a bit higher. You could as well agree while that case has maybe even just started. But I think it's quite interesting to see between 2017 and 18, the number of decisions have dropped quite tremendously. I think they were around, 9 decisions in 2017. It dropped down to basically 3 decisions in 18, even to 2 decisions in 2019. So we just need to see if this trend continues. But I think a lot of things, again, have as well been, let's say, quite clear now, I think, over time. We need to see, I think, after Professor Wasem has obviously, let's say, left the head of the arbitration board, where this maybe again, going up again further, because then you could also check maybe if the kind of new arbitration board, maybe the new lead might as well come down to different results there. So this is basically, let's say, my kind of summary for the drug development, but also for the pricing. I think, to me, I think a couple of things are quite clearer now. I think after 10 years, I think some are probably still, let's say, in the open sphere. So looking forward now and giving the words to you, Thomas, and looking forward as well to your thoughts and to your kind of experiences as well. And what you can maybe, or let's say, which kind of light you could maybe as well bring to those questions around the AMNOG.
Thank you, Stefan. So it was, you mentioned a lot of things, so I'll go faster over with things where I've done, where we have similarities. So let's go to the next slide, and or to the and the next one. I wanted to start, when I thought about the 10 years, what happened. So I want to start with a brief history. So why are we here? And it started well in the not 10 years ago, but something like 50 years ago, when scientists had the idea of market access, of health technology assessment, of value-based pricing, and so on. And this idea, and this next, please, became infectious. So it infected during the 1990s, maybe a little bit earlier, some of the health policy systems. So next. Yeah, so Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, Sweden, the Netherlands were early things, and this infection of the healthcare systems with the idea of value-based pricing and something like those came really pandemic, and only one country is resistant, but Germany 10 years ago became infected. And at that time, and stay with this, it was something like the expulsion from paradise. It was called in the pharmaceutical industry, because before AMNOG there was free pricing, full reimbursement, so a paradise for pharmaceutical industry, which is certainly not true. It was also a tough environment, but it didn't have this fourth hurdle we know from the UK and other countries. So, and what happened then? Then we came to this to this process and the AMNOG, and we can show on the next slide a little bit more. And it's a complex process. It's very bureaucratic. So there are a lot of rules to consider, and that's one of the things you should take. Go to people like Stefan and Lutz from us, who knows this process extremely well, and can help you to find your way through the process and see where the tipping points are. So important is here, of course, the dossier, but as Stefan mentioned, it begins earlier with first consultations. You can consult and ask the GBA. This is not a consultation where you go with a blank sheet of paper and ask, so what is the best way to do this trial? What are your recommendations? It's another way of consultation. It's more the way, so here we have a study. What do you think about this study? And they will say, well, it's good or bad, or maybe we cannot judge today. But unless it's not a discussion where you can creatively work together with the GBA, it's important, because you know, for example, what is your comparator, and this is relevant for clinical development. This is even not on this sheet, which is taken from, I think, from the Ministry of Health. So this is a process, and I don't want to go into the details. But where are we now today? So the next is we are celebrating. We are celebrating with sparkling water today. And we are now, and it's the next, and then we stop the animated thing. We are in a new normal. And that's the important thing. It's not something very special. Germany just followed those countries who are doing health technology assessment, who are doing reimbursement decisions, who are defining prices based off benefit or cost benefit assessment. And we do only part of it, only the benefit assessment. So a lot of the economic thinking we know as that the industry is bringing into the UK, into England and Scotland and Australia is irrelevant. We do not need cost effectiveness. We do not need budget impact analysis within the process. Okay, so the next, we are in the new normal, and probably this is one chart showing the relevance of the AMNOG after 10 years. You see on the left side, the in red, the net expenditure of the statutory health insurance, which is about 41 billion euro for pharmaceuticals. And without all these things we have in Germany to lower the prices, to save money, it will be something like 63%. And we see the savings come mainly from generics companies with fixed reference prices or therapeutic pricing tenders, which mainly affect both generic companies, and the originators have to pay mandatory rebates. Generic companies have too, but they can find ways to get out of it by price reductions. So mandatory rebates are those who the originators typically pay. And here we see in the purple box the AMNOG. The AMNOG accounts now for 3.6 billion euro of savings compared when you compare the launch price and then go down to the negotiated price. So it's a huge saving for the healthcare system. And it affects manufacturers, originators much more than the mandatory rebates we had much longer than the AMNOG. Okay, let's go to the next. And yeah, that are key success factors. I was asked to talk about it from the way that I experienced when I've been in the industry and was working on the process, on the dossier, on the price negotiations, and now from the academic point of view, and also from advice meetings with the company. And I think the first thing is there are two layers where it can be successful and you should work on. This is the informal layer and the informal aspects, so how you deal with the process and with the people who are managing the process. And then there are the formal aspect, the what, so the facts about. So the first, Stefan, is it's the same thinking like in marketing. You have to focus on your customer needs. To be successful in marketing, you have to focus on your customer. And here you also have to look at the GBA, at the IQWiG, at the people in the GBA, the decision makers, as customers. They want something from you. They want information about your product and about the benefit of your product. And one has to understand what are their needs, and then really go to them, talk to them, not only in the formal process with a hearing, for example, but approach them. If you have a completely new therapy like a gene therapy, they will have a lot of questions because it's completely new. It might not be the same if you bring the third SGLT2 inhibitor in diabetes. But if you bring something very new, or in orphan diseases, which the people do not know, then they have a lot of questions and need information, and you can serve them with this information with informal talks. And if you approach the members of the GBA from the physician association or from the hospital association, they will be open to discuss and to ask. So the next point is transparency. Everything will come will be open. It will be openly available. It's nothing that you can hide anything in your clinical trials. So if we look into the details, we have now for side effects a new part of the dossier, which is something like 500 pages of information on side effects. So you cannot hide the weak points of your drug, and you have to be completely transparent. And one thing is important, it was raised last week at the GBA celebration symposium. Those data will be published, so that everything will be publicly available, and you cannot have a black label on something and say, well, this data cannot be published. Everything is transparent, so nothing you can hide. So that's something important to consider. And the next is be sincere about your product and the data. So here you have to step away from the pure marketing perspective, where you want to sell a drug and you focus on the positive aspects. Be sincere and say, well, what are the positive and what are the negative impacts? Because that is what is analyzed in a very detailed way. And sometimes one gets the experience that somebody says, well, I think we have some weaknesses, but they are not so important. The other weighed out. So really, if you think, well, there are weaknesses, make a good assessment how important those are to the GBA. If you have side effects, if you have deficits in the length of your study, the GBA will be very strict on that normally. So that does most things I want to say for the informal aspects. Formal aspects are two. The first is process, and we've seen the process in the on the slides. So that is extremely important to know this process, to know what has to be done at which point in time. Take your time to prepare the dossiers. It takes a year at least. So if when you start submitting to the EMA, start to prepare your dossier. Otherwise, you will not be finished. And the most important thing across everything, and Stefan said, well, there are ways to optimize your dossier, but most successful will be the dossiers which have a good clinical data. So you can try and you can do a lot, but sometimes there's a risk that indirect comparison is not accepted because of differences. Historical comparison are difficult. So invest in the clinical development and therefore go to the consultation before phase 3 in order to optimize your clinical trial program. So what is the main, what are the most important things? And I've seen there were some questions in the Q&A, so in the chat. So what is important? I think I've got here this ample system. So typically, direct head-to-head comparison is a gold standard, and you should try to do that. Indirect comparison can work, but one will have a very close look of whether this clinical trials included in an indirect comparison are really similar, so that you can do that. And especially the EQUIC is very tough on that. If you do not have comparative data, there must be extremely good arguments to convince that the study with a single-arm trial or with a wrong comparator shows added benefit. Usually it doesn't. And what we see here is the endpoints, also important. Mortality seem to be the most important, but the question of health-related quality of life and patient-reported outcomes when it comes to the assessment of symptoms is gaining more and more weight in the assessment and the decision making. So at best, you should focus on both on mortality and on health-related quality of life, which is very closely related to symptoms and side effects. So play on everything. The more convincing data you have. If you tick the box for mortality and for health-related quality of life, your situation in the negotiation is much better as if you have only in one box a positive benefit. Yeah, and surrogate endpoints like PFS, Stefan mentioned, PFS is not accepted so far. PFS is assessed, and there's always the claim that there are different views in the GBA whether progression-free survival is really a patient-relevant outcome, and so far the GBR looks at it, but ignores the data in their decision-making. And when we look into the future, I'm not very optimistic that it will change, because in the end, the AMNOG benefit assessment is a preparation for the price negotiation, and if you grant too many drugs an added benefit, the system will run into problems, especially in the high-priced oncology field. So I'm not so optimistic on progression-free survival in the future, and I would recommend every company doing research in oncology to focus, if possible, on mortality and on health-related quality of life. Okay, the next, please. Yeah, we've seen this, and there was also one question. So maybe for the last, patient-reported outcomes are also becoming more and more important. That was also so. There was one question: what happens? So we have two situations. The one is you have a positive additional benefit, and then you can negotiate a price somewhere between your launch price and the price of the appropriate comparator therapy. So ACT is the acronym for appropriate comparator therapy, which is defined by the GBA and is the drug or a basket of drugs against which you have to compare your new drug. If you have no additional benefit, you cannot achieve a price leading to higher costs than the appropriate comparator. And if there are more than one appropriate comparator, then the cheapest one is the relevant one. So if you have a comparator set of one patent-protected drug and one generic drug, and you fail to show added benefits, you will have to face a price level of the generic drug. Okay, next, please. So here we see the discount or the rebate that has been negotiated in all these negotiations, and we see that for different benefit levels. And I think one thing is very clear. You see the minimum, the maximum, and the mean rebate, and we see that there's a huge variation. So that is just mirrors that each and any negotiation is different and has different parameters going into, and we've seen the many parameters which run into it. The main criterion for the negotiation is, of course, the added benefit and the price of the appropriate comparator therapies. It's the most decisive factor in the negotiations, but the European prices also play a role. And there was a question on Brexit and will the UK fall out? Well, the law says it has to be European price, and it's not considered to be European Union countries from which these prices come. So the UK can stay, at least from a legal point of view. We don't know whether the sickness funds and the pharmaceutical companies will change this, but I think they can stay in this basket of comparators. What we see else, we see it doesn't, of course, with no added benefit, we have 26% reduction on average, and with a benefit we have smaller reductions, and if you have a considerable benefit, beträchtlichen Zusatznutzen, it's somewhat smaller, but the difference between minor and non-quantifiable is not that big. So one might come to the conclusion that it's more important to have benefits, and the question, is the degree now considerable or is it a minor benefit? Let's take a look from the other side. This is the rebate from your launch price to the negotiated price. On the next slide, we see the markup if you come from the appropriate comparator, and that is the thinking of the sickness funds association. They think, so this is the comparator, you have an added benefit, and now you get more. So how much more do you get? So at the bottom, you see all drugs have a markup of 300%, which is a lot. And you see for positive added benefit, it's 518. So this is the effect of the added benefit. And here we see clearly a difference between minor and considerable or major benefit. So if you look at from the markup side, there seem to be bigger differences on the markups. However, and I think that's on the next slide, if you look into the situation, so if you have a positive additional benefit, and that's my main message on that, then the situation is great. You can be very happy. If you have no added benefit, the next, then you have to consider what is your appropriate comparator therapy. So if this is a patent protected drug, you can still be very happy and you're in a comfortable situation because your price is linked to another patent protected drug and therefore to a usually high price. But if it's generic, then you are in big trouble, because then your price cannot be higher than those of the generic drug. And there are some cases where the manufacturers really came to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense to sell the product in Germany in this kind of situation. So that's very briefly, but it shows the main points of the price negotiation and to say what is the relevance of additional benefit or positive benefit. So the last slide, this might be the outlook. So what will happen in the future? Well, nobody knows, but I think a few points are very clear. And when we heard the stakeholders in the celebration symposium last week, it was clear that it's a learning system, this AMNOG system. It will evolve further. Clinical data are key, and you should make no compromise on that if you want to be successful. There's always a question about real-world evidence, modeling studies. Not today, not in the near future. Real-world data might, in single assessments, become important, but will not be a standard. What is important are quality of life and patient-reported outcomes. Regarding other aspects, innovative contracting is usually not done with the head association because they cannot do it on behalf of the individual single sickness fund. So therefore, innovative contracting is something which would make sense, especially for gene therapies we've seen in the last few years, but it's not the standard. There's a question for economists, as I am cost-benefit assessment, something I've not heard that the direction goes into this direction. So there are a lot of questions on free pricing during the first 12 months. So I think that will be a political battle between the Association of the Pharmaceutical Companies and the head association, and there are two opposite opinions of that, of course. So, yeah, we will see. Orphan drug privilege, that will follow more or less the orphan drug regulation, which will be changed by EMA, by the European Union. And well, a European health technology assessment, I think that's something at least the German Ministry of Health is not supporting, and there are some people who support those. So that will stay, at least in the next few years, a German process, and will not move to a European health technology assessment. So thank you for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you, Thomas. I think really good insights, further insights, and I think a couple of further as well opinions, and also I think learnings out of your experience. I think just very briefly, I think as a conclusion, then I think we can go as well to the probably still open or a couple of open questions, because I think Thomas, you have as well taken already some of those and have answered those. I think that is great. But I think at the end of the day, I think that is where I think we have, let's say, as well came up with the same kind of conclusion. I think one is plan your submission appropriately, meaning as well already plan your clinical trial in the best way before submitting, and even, let's say, finalizing then as well your kind of drug development program, that you have the best clinical package available when going to the GBA. And finally, I think I would also agree, even though that maybe on average the price discount is somewhere around the 20%, I think every single negotiation is something else, so something different. And hence there might be different drivers, and you never know if you're based on the average or whether you're somewhere around those kind of quite huge variations, meaning that you could also have a big hit on your price, or also be maybe on the, let's say, more positive side, that maybe your kind of discount is maybe even a bit smaller. So that was it, I think, from our side. I think back to you, Lutz. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Stefan, for your wonderful presentations. All now it's the time for your questions. You raised many. So thank you, Thomas. You already covered some of them. As the UK still in the price basket, or about the endpoints, but let me pick up some. We had some actually, some of the audience, they were actually listening to the 10 years AMNOG party and raising some stuff there, for example, about what you also mentioned, that the orphan drugs will lose that privilege of an added benefit by law, right? I mean, that is well discussed. There were some people who, a little bit, stretched it out too much, I think, right? And that's just a natural reaction. And as also about that, that's the question, what do you think about Josef Hecken's idea to set the price to the point of the GBA Beschluss? I think this person means that the free price is only valid for 6 months, and then you actually, negotiate and you have to pay back what you get too much after the 6 months. So I think this is also a reaction of like too high prices, right? We'll see that, because there was another question of a person. What do you think is the impact or the benefit in pricing on the benefit and pricing discount analysis presented by you, Stefan, and which impact have that on that strategy, on that negotiation strategy, and the industry and the future of that industry pricing? Well, it will have an impact. Everything will have an impact. It's a living system. What do you what is your opinion on that, Stefan and Thomas?
Yeah, I think I'm always, let's say, smiling a bit when I hear about, for example, as well, the kind of let's say cost savings which have been achieved, right? And I think, Thomas, you mentioned it exactly. I mean, that is just based when comparing the kind of, let's say, negotiated price versus the launch price. But ultimately, we all do not know if there are really the, let's say, kind of those cost savings, or whether just the industry is really strategically moving already into that direction by just saying, I know more or less which kind of discount I could potentially expect. And hence I obviously price it already a bit higher in comparison to a kind of situation without a negotiation, right? So, ultimately, I think, Lutz, as you said, I think all of those, let's say, analysis will and might have an impact, but I think also obviously on both sides, because I think not to forget, I think also the negotiators on the Statutory Health Insurance Fund side, I think they are real professionals. I think they are very experienced, and they can do negotiations, and they also know those analysis and have even further analysis. So they will also drive some of those, and that is also where we see that kind of huge, let's say, variations as well in terms of price discount. What do you think, Thomas?
Yeah, and especially, I don't know whether there's an incentive to have an extremely high price in the beginnings. That might be for orphan drugs, but if you have competitors in the market, those are considered in the price negotiation. Also, the European price levels. Also, you mentioned not every price is available. are mentioned. So there is something, some benchmarks that are considered. So you're not free to say, well, I take double of what I want expect and hope for the best. So it has to be a realistic price even at launch.
Yeah.
And I think most of the companies really do this very, very realistic. So not thinking that this is exaggerated at the things. We made an analysis a few years ago. We haven't done that again. On the relation to the European prices, and that was interesting to see that before launch, the German launch price was 40 to 50% above the average of the European price, and after the negotiation, it was on the lower level of the European prices. So the European price levels have some impact on the negotiations that should also be considered.
Mm.
Very good. Another part of the questions were about the line extensions. I mean, for every, you bring your drug first to the market, and then you have another line extensions, even like for pediatric use, right? You go into another benefit assessment, and of course, there's another price negotiation. So the questions are, have you an idea of average price discount for line extensions? I think minus 20% is likely for launch, or what is your impression on that, or what is your recommendation on that?
Well, we did an analysis, we did not publish, but we've seen that the 25%, 20 to 25%, the first negotiation is an average, and then we see there are more discounts, but this levels off after 3 new indications. We've seen this in oncology a lot with drugs having 10 or so. So the level remains very stable after the search negotiations, and there is not much movement. And if I remember correctly, it was an additional 5 to 10% for the second on average. But there can be also situations where you can get a higher price if you have an extremely good second indication and a good additional benefit. But on average, you can say, well, second will add some 5 to 10% discount, but then it remains rather stable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would also agree. I think, but also here, I think it heavily depends again. I think how you basically go in, right? I mean, if you have first a very kind of small indication, then you suddenly come on with a kind of big budget impact opportunity with huge kind of number of patients. It might obviously be the other way around. But I think on average, I would agree. I think we have had as well a kind of deeper look, probably already as well a while ago. And I think obviously, let's say mimicking what you have just reported, Thomas. Lutz, I interrupted you as well.
That's fine. I just move on to the next question here. We look at all these personalized medicines and therapies, and the question is, what has AMNOG learned during the last 10 years? That also in rare disease, the size of the study population gets smaller and smaller. And so the classical statistics, the statistical analysis are like out of range.
Yeah, I mean, of course, but I think at the end of the day, I think the whole kind of, let's say, process has already, I think, changed for orphan drugs. I think a few years after the initiation of AMNOG, right? Because also of those kind of, let's say, issues. I think sometimes you have just really small, let's say, numbers in those trials, or maybe you have, let's say, difficulties to do kind of comparative study, or if you do a comparative study, the numbers are too small to also show significance. I think that is, where I think the whole process has already, let's say, taken that into considerations. And I think that's also, I think, what I would at least say as well from the experiences out of the discussions and oral hearings, what also at least the head of the GBA is taken into consideration. I think you need to show that you have done the best you could in order to bring up the best evidence available. And I think here, I think it's also, again, going back to the clinicians, I think, from my perspective, to also show the importance, for example, of the product and or of the unmet need in a given disease area, I would say.
Very good. Then there's a practical question. Do you recommend specific digital budget impact tools during the price negotiations? Well, you've both have been into price negotiation. What is your opinion on that? No.
No.
It's good for yourself to know your budget impact, your sales very well, but the thinking is not budget impact like. Astonishingly, but these arguments do not resonate with the Sickness Fund Association.
No, I would agree. I think you obviously, let's say, negotiate a lot of times also just on the number of patients, but not, let's say, the number of patients and the price as a kind of budget impact. So that is why I would say it's not really needed, but I would agree with you, Thomas. I think you would obviously need to have probably more your kind of, let's say, business analysis, right? That to also see and to also be able to analyze as well in a quite rapid way how to respond to maybe an offer by the by the insurance side. But I think a budget impact model, I think for the negotiation itself, I think is not needed in the German context.
Then there are some general questions of understanding about that non-quantifiable added benefit, right? How price is decided in that case? Can you help there a little bit, Stefan?
Yeah, I think it's basically, I think what we said also early on, I think, again, it depends again, I think if it's basically an orphan drug, for example, which got a non-quantifiable added benefit because there was maybe some kind of data available, but it's really just not quantifiable, right? Or whether it's just be, let's say, based on an orphan drug which has granted or let's say received that benefit level because of the legal regulation, or maybe even if it's a product which has no orphan drug designation, but just received a non-quantifiable added benefit based on your, let's say on the evidence itself. And I think finally, again, it depends as well on all of those different things. I think we both have as well just shown beforehand, right? On the size of the population, on the unmet need, on the kind of differences as well versus the appropriate comparator, etc. I think this is really difficult to say in a very general way.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And now one last question about patient preferences. That has a relatively limited impact in the German HTA decision right now. However, patient voice is getting stronger and stronger. What are the panelists' views of the impact of patient preferences data over the next few years?
I'm a little bit skeptical. We have the patient view with the quality of life, and that's enough. So I think the main problem is the preferences cover everything, and they cover something like mode of administration, which can be a strong impact on the preferences for or against the drug. And this is something which is not in the criteria for the patient relevant outcomes. So therefore, all those things who are not patient relevant can have an impact. For example, we know from preference studies that a good HbA1c reduction is preferred by diabetes patients, but it's a lab parameter which is not accepted. So here you have the interaction between surrogate endpoints and impact on preference, and so this situation is, if something measures surrogates, it's not relevant for the benefit assessment. I think that will remain. So I would, for studies which are planned now, focus really on the pros to measure the symptoms and to look on the quality of life.
I can only agree with you, Thomas. I think preferences are probably not something what I see as a kind of additional potential endpoint in the whole process. I fully agree.
Wonderful. I think that was a good conclusion here for a good discussion. Thank you again, Thomas Hammerschmidt and Stefan Walzer, for this wonderful presentations. And I want to also give the audience the hint. If you speak German, the story continues on Clubhouse. Yes, we do now Clubhouse. And actually in a week, Thomas, we speak to each other again here in our Clubhouse talk. 10 Jahre AMNOG, 10 years AMNOG. The discussion in German with Stefan Walzer, myself, you, Thomas Hammerschmidt, and then also with Professor Dr. David Maciejewicz, Heike Schellhorn, and our good friend Bibiane Schütte-Bosse, great lawyer if you need one, and then Dr. Matthias Blume here. Join us on Clubhouse on April 1st. We're not making April 1st jokes there. Okay, and then finally, our next webinar will be access to German hospitals. Our good friend Willy Wilner will join us here from the clinics in Bad Wildungen. So happy to see you again all here at the last Thursday in April with our good friend Willy Wilner. Access to German hospitals, pathways to follow. Well, that's it. Join our webinar here recording on YouTube. Go on our YouTube channel. You can also upload that. And thanks again, Stefan and also Thomas Hammerschmidt here for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you all, and good night, and stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.